The focus of this video is going to be to figure out how cattle actually developed that extra big muscle phenotype. So where did that trait come from? So we know now that farmers can use visual representations called Punnett squares to make predictions about what the chances are that they are going to get cattle when they breed to parents that have that extra big muscle trait. So we know if we have two cattle that have the big E allele, which means they have extra big muscles, if we have a male that has that and we have a female that has an extra big and a little e muscle, these are all the probabilities of offspring they could have. So it turns out there's a 50% chance that they're going to have those extra big muscles. There's a 50% chance that they're going to have medium-sized muscles. And in this case, there's a 0% chance that they're going to have the typical muscles. So that works really well if you have some cows that have either the extra big muscle phenotype or the medium muscle phenotype. But what's going to happen if a farmer actually wants to start breeding extra big muscle cattle, but they don't have any heavily muscled or medium muscle cattle to start with? So what can they do to start getting some of these extra big muscle cattle? So if we think back to our pedigree chart, we know that if we have cattle down here at the bottom, offspring that have either medium or extra big muscles, there's a big E. There's a big E in these alleles. So that big E had to come from a parent. So we should be able to trace those big E's way back. We can go to grandparents. We should be able to go further and go to great-parents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents, and things like that. So can we do that? It turns out that we can. So in the 1800s, in Italy, in a region called the Guerne d'Alba, which I am probably not pronouncing right, this extra big muscle trait suddenly showed up. So prior to the 1800s, you didn't see cattle that had medium muscles or extra big muscles. They all just had typical muscles. So here's what that would look like in a Punnett square, or excuse me, not a Punnett square, but a pedigree chart. So if the parents all have typical muscles, then the offspring are going to have typical muscles, and the grandparents are all going to have typical muscles. So the only allele or form of the gene that's out there is the typical muscle. There's no other allele at this point. So this is before the 1800s. Well, at some point during the 1800s, all of a sudden, this big E allele shows up. And once it shows up once, if it gets passed down to the offspring, now we've got an offspring here that has medium muscles, right? Because they have a big E and a little e. And then that particular cattle has the potential to pass that big E allele onto their children. And so we start seeing it show up again. So by 1900, just in Italy alone, there were over 500,000, so 500,000 of these extra muscled cows that we know have a genotype of Big E showing up in Italy. So when you have a new allele that comes into the picture, it's called a mutation. So this big E allele was a mutation. And a mutation is just a small random change in the structure of a chromosome that can result in a new allele. So in this case, a big E. And that big E, that allele, can be passed on to offspring. Oftentimes, although not always, mutations happen when egg and sperm cell are being formed. So we have a mutation, which results in a new allele. And we know alleles dictate the type of protein that is made. So in this case, when we're talking about extra big muscles, we know that's myostatin protein. And the big E allele, so this mutation that results in the big E allele causes this myostatin protein that's kind of a funny shape. So it doesn't fit into the receptor, and so the message doesn't get into the cell, and then the extra big muscles are created. This is in contrast to the typical myostatin protein, which has this nice shape that fits really, really well, and then the message gets sent from the receptor into the cell, and typical muscles are. So you might be wondering, how often do these mutations happen? Are they common or are they rare? If you said common, you're actually not right. They don't happen very often. They're pretty rare. And that's okay to be not right, by the way. So if we look at mammals, scientists have actually studied this. So specific scientists that look at genetics have looked at a bunch of organisms, including mammals. And mutations occur in general about 1 per every 10,000 alleles. So what that means is that if we have just a hypothetical population of 10,000 people, 9,999 people in that population would have a typical allele, and only one person out of all those 999,000 would have a gene that had allele with a mutation. If we look at fruit flies, we see the numbers are about the same. And if we look at bacteria, it's even more rare. So a mutation occurs in genes in bacteria about 1 time in every 100 million times. So super, super rare. So if you looked at the same gene in bacteria of 900 or almost a million, so 99,999,999 would have the typical allele, and 1. So 1 out of 100 million would have a gene that had a mutated allele. So really, really rare to have a mutation in bacteria, and pretty darn rare to have mutations in mammals and fruit flies as well. But those mutations do happen, and that's what leads eventually to new traits, new phenotypes, like the extra large muscles that we see in cattle.